Welcome back. I'm David Gura. President Trump came into office almost a year ago, promising a new foreign policy that would put national security and America first. National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster called the president's unorthodox approach, quote, pragmatic realism. He said, quote, there are problems that may be both intractable and of marginal interest to the American people that do not justify investments of blood and treasure. Something complicating the president's foreign policy agenda is Russia. Bloomberg News reports that the Kremlin is calling the failure to restore goodwill with the United States one of their top disappointments of the year. And as threats from North Korea to continue to escalate, the president's putting a lot of blame on the Chinese. After South Korea seized a ship transferring oil to North Korea, President Trump tweeted this, quote, caught red-handed, very disappointed that China is allowing oil to go into North Korea. There will never be a friendly solution to the North Korea problem if this continues to happen. China, for its part, has denied any involvement. A lot to discuss here. I'm joined by the founder of Liberty Government Affairs, that's Brian Darling, along with the former DNC Communications Director, Adam Hodge, and Steve Shale. He's here as well. He's a Democratic strategist. Brian, let me start with you. Here we are a year in. How fully formed do you think this president's foreign policy agenda is? Do we have a Trump doctrine easily defined?
Well, I think we're getting there. I think actually foreign policy was one of the reasons why I voted for Donald Trump. I am a person who worked for Senator Rand Paul. I support a restrained foreign policy. I think that there's been a mixed bag, but overall, I like the Trump foreign policy. His tough talk against North Korea is important to keep them in check. He tweeted just yesterday about Iran and the uprising happening in Iran. It's important that he does things like that to support freedom movements throughout the globe. I'm a little disappointed in Afghanistan and having more troops there, and I worry that people like H.R. McMaster, who are more hawkish, may push his foreign policy a little bit more in an activist direction. But his rhetoric, he's been consistent with his rhetoric, his campaign rhetoric, and he's been very restrained to date.
Brian, are you satisfied here that he's listening to your former boss, listening to Rand Paul? We see Senator Tom Cotton wielding more and more influence here on the president's thinking when it comes to foreign policy. When you look at the views associated with Rand Paul, do you think they're getting through to the president still?
I do. I know that Rand Paul's reasonably close to President Trump, and I would rather see Rand Paul's foreign policy than Tom Cotton's foreign policy or Lindsey Graham's. I think that a more restrained foreign policy going forward, making sure that we're not overusing our military force, not nation building, getting away from nation building, and basically taking back a lot of the policies that Donald Trump inherited from both George W. Bush and Barack Obama. Remember, Barack Obama's, he defied rhetoric. He promised to get the troops out of Afghanistan, promised to close down Gitmo, did none of those things. So I'm hoping that Trump's rhetoric is reflected in this next year, 2018, with a restrained foreign policy.
Adam Hodge, let me turn to you. Brian Darling, they're talking about kind of a radical change going against the rhetoric that we heard from President Obama. As you look back on the last year here, are there any successes you can point to? I think of what we have seen here at the UN in New York, a lot of movement on the North Korea issue in particular. What successes, if any, could you point to when you look at this president's foreign policy?
David, that's a really tough question. I think you look, and one of the things you've heard mentioned is the president's rhetoric. That rhetoric has actually made us less safe. That rhetoric, where we've seen it in his Twitter feed, has actually brought us to the brink of war. And you've seen him roll back a number of the major accomplishments, or try to roll back a number of the major accomplishments from the last administration. Just look at the former President Obama's pivot to Asia. That strengthened our role in what everybody acknowledges is one of the fastest growing regions in the world. We were put on a platform to really exercise tremendous influence in that region. And President Trump has just walked away from that entirely. You know, he claims that he's going to talk tough with China, but if you look at the actual results and actions, there's been very little to speak of. And so I think when we look ahead at the next year, you know, it's important that members of the Democratic Party actually hold him accountable and force him to implement some of the policies that are actual law. For example, like the passage of Iran sanctions.
Let me get Steve Shale in the conversation here. Let's pivot to Asia ourselves here and look at the North Korea policy and China policy as well. I'll draw again from that interview the New York Times did with President Trump earlier this week. President Trump saying to Michael Schmidt, "I like very much President Xi. He treated me better than anybody's ever been treated in the history of China. You know, the presentations, one of the two great days of anybody's life. He's a friend of mine. He likes me. I like him. We have a great chemistry together. Again, Steve Schale, let's try to contrast that with what we've seen here over the last few days. Some bellicose rhetoric on the president's Twitter feed, some ill will, ill feelings toward China about the degree to which they've enforced sanctions on North Korea. How do you square the two things, the personal relationship and the policy?
Well, one thing on China, I actually just got back from 2 weeks in Southeast Asia, and the thing that was fascinating to Adam's point is that we've just literally walked away from the entire region. I mean, the Chinese should love Donald Trump because he's basically, given the Chinese complete control over the economic future of one of the fastest growing parts of the world. And so, I just found it sort of stunning that we've given up not only our voice on things like human rights, but really just walked away from one of the most important regions in the world.
Brian Darling, I'll ask you lastly here just sort of who you're looking to for guidance on what this administration's foreign policy is going to be in the year 2018. I look at the op-ed Secretary of State Rex Tillerson wrote for the New York Times this week, defending American diplomacy under President Trump. I'll again mention the UN, and we see the role that Ambassador Nikki Haley has been playing here, kind of at the vanguard when you look at this administration's foreign policy portfolio. Who are you listening to? Secretary of State Rex Tillerson, Ambassador Nikki Haley, or National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster?
None of them. Donald Trump I'm listening to, because ultimately he's going to do what he wants to do. He's going to move forward with the policies that he feels comfortable with. And we've seen the president contradict all of those individuals in his own administration on different subject matters. And that's just the way he operates. So I'm going to listen very closely to his rhetoric, watch his Twitter feed. And we have seen him voice support through his Twitter feed for this uprising in Iran. I think that is significant and very important. It's been largely ignored by the mainstream media. All they want to talk about is his interview with the New York Times and him going off script without staffers present.
All right, Brian.
David, the problem there is that he's actually not listening. He's not listening to people who actually have national security experience. H.R. McMaster is a general, and if he's just pushing aside anything that you hear from H.R. McMaster, that actually gives us more pause, gives us even more concern that he's actually going to follow through and execute something that makes us less safe.
All right, Adam Hodge,
he's
Brian
doing
Darling,
a much better job than President Obama, I'll tell you that.
We will leave it there.
I disagree.
We'll leave it there. We'll leave it with that disagreement. That's Adam Hodge, Brian Darling, Steve Schale joining me this afternoon. Gentlemen, thank you very much for the time. And we'll be right back.